Alright, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this video. Today, our objective is to know and understand how the scientific method can be used in science class and how it's also going to be used in the outside world and how it has been used in the past. Before we get into that, let's take a little bit of a trip back, and if I were to ask you who gave birth to the scientific method, how might you respond? There are probably plenty of well-known scientists that you may already know, and maybe, Isaac Newton, Aristotle, Albert Einstein, but these guys actually did not give birth to the scientific method. It was actually during the golden age of Arabic science. A man named Abu Ali al-Hassa, and that's not his only name, he has several names. He moved to Cairo, Egypt in the 11th century, and he was a well-known scientist. He actually said that he could control the floods of the Nile River, and once he attempted to do this, he actually realized how difficult of a job it was and that he wasn't going to be able to do it. And instead, fearing for his life, he basically stated that he was crazy and was placed under house arrest to protect himself by a very powerful caliph in 1011. During that time, he just used it to study science. He wrote the book of Optics with a powerful message saying, don't take my word for it, see for yourself. Kind of telling us all that, hey, you may hear about all these things, but it would be even more powerful for you to see that for yourself, to see if things are actually true. And that's kind of what the scientific method does. We kind of know that certain things are true just based on things we hear, but when we actually see it, that's when it becomes a little bit more powerful. So he was one of the first to operate on the scientific method as we know it. Here's a picture of him. He performed observations, experiments, rationalized his arguments to support all of his theories, and that led to his vision of optics, and he is also believed to have invented the first pinhole camera. So we can thank him for the scientific method, or the beginnings of it. Now today, you may have watched this show called Mythbusters. They use the scientific method every time they perform their show, and they're very open about it, and they actually explain a lot of what they have to do to make their experiments reliable. And we're actually going to touch on one of their experiments as we go through and review the scientific method today. So where do we begin? Well, technically, you begin with an observation. Usually that observation leads you to some sort of question that you might have, so we call that a problem. That problem is going to include the purpose of the experiment and ask us a question about the purpose. So, good scientific question, it's going to be a yes or a no answer to that question. You don't have to be vague, you don't have a whole bunch of possible answers. It's either yes or no. It has to be testable, you have to be able to measure it, kind of like when we were forming our personal goals. You have to be able to measure that goal. You can't be broad. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to hang out with my friends once a week. You need to say specifically what you're going to do and how many times during that week, so you can actually look back and say, hey, did I achieve that goal? Forming a good scientific question works very similarly. And then it's also going to ask if the independent variable actually affects the dependent variable. So when you're trying to go back and identify your IV and DV, you should be able to find it in your question. You also should be able to find it in your hypothesis, which we will get to shortly. So we're going to use an experiment that the Mythbusters did, which is swimming in syrup. And they were wondering, can you swim in syrup at the same rate of speed you swim in water? Did you hear the IV and DV in there? Can you swim in syrup at the same rate of speed you swim in water? So the IV there is a type of substance you're swimming in. The DV is the rate at which you swim in that substance. A bad question would be something like, why do people litter in the park? It's not a yes or no answer. It would be really hard to test because there's so many reasons for it. Nothing to prove wrong here, really, and then there's no variables that are identifiable. Alright, your next step is going to be research, or you may already have enough prior knowledge that you wouldn't need to do this. But if your question or your problem is something you are very unfamiliar with, you may want to do a little bit of background research, consult the internet, consult a book, consult somebody else you may know, and then use that to form your educated guess. Now, we say educated guess is a kind of a definition for a hypothesis. It's a proposed answer to a question as well, and guess kind of assumes that you haven't really deeply thought about it, but you do when you form your hypothesis. You use research or your prior knowledge to form those. So, getting into that formation of a hypothesis, it's going to restate the scientific question in an if-then form. So it answers the yes or no of the scientific question, again, based upon the research we just talked about, not your own personal opinions. So if I swim in syrup, then the rate at which I swim will slow down. That's what I'm going to say for this scenario that we're using as an example. Then your experiment. What does that include? Material setup and your procedure. Now, it's very important that a good procedure has at least 3 numbered logical steps. You will be asked to produce this several times throughout the year. So we normally ask you for at least 3, includes the IV and DV, or in some way, shape, or form it is evident of what those are. You provide constants, and you also suggest that you're going to repeat your trials. Alright, the control of your experiment is the item being used for comparison. This is basically, or in some way, shape, or form, the opposite of what you are testing, or it's basically the item being left alone, but your constants still have to apply to it. So in our scenario here, our control is water, because that's what we normally do. That's going to be our basis for comparison. So our control group would be anybody who swam in water. The actual control variable is water. Then our experimental group will be anybody who swam in the syrup, and the IV is the syrup water in this case. Constants. This is what remains constant throughout the experiment. These are also known as controlled variables. So notice we have a control, which was what we are comparing our experimental variable to, and then we have controlled variables, also known as constants, which are just any other variable in the experiment that must be kept the same for both groups. So this seems to get very confusing for students, so make sure when we're practicing this, you're remembering the difference between the two. Some constants for this experiment: same distance swam, same number of trials tested, probably a similar physical capability between the people that are performing the test. Those would all be good examples. Your dependent versus independent variable. Remember, nothing it affects the independent variable. That is just what you are manipulating. So if you think of independent, it starts with an I. You are the person performing the experiment, so I manipulate it. The dependent variable is affected by what you do. It's affected by whatever the independent variable is. And I like to think of it as what you are measuring. So again, here's your comparison. IV changed by the experimenter. It's not affected by anything. That's why it's called independent. Dependent, it is the variable being measured, what is being tested in the question and the hypothesis, and it's affected by the independent variable. After we perform the experiment, we can collect data. It's important to know the difference between an inference versus an observation. An inference is something that might be based on textual information you've seen or prior knowledge. An observation is something you actually see. So you can only use your actual observations in your experiment to say whether or not what happened, or if your hypothesis was proven wrong or right in your experiment. You can have quantitative or qualitative data. It's very good to have both. Those quantitative numbers, though, are usually have a little bit more substance to them, a little bit more reliability. So think quantity, meaning numbers, and then quality for qualitative, things like color, smell, shape, and textures. Then you're going to analyze your data and see what it says. This includes all the data collected, usually in a chart of some sort. You're going to tell about the data by using graphs and words. So I have 2 different example graphs. This one is a bar graph that's simply comparing movie genre preference within a small group. So if you're making a comparison, this would be a good type of chart to use or graph to use. If you're actually wanting to see patterns, this graph shows a positive relationship between the number of hours studied versus the test scores achieved. So if you look, only studying for 5 hours, very short time frames, generally speaking, has lower, test scores over here on your DV. If you go up higher to anywhere from 25 to 35 hours, it seems like that percentage is going up higher. All right, finally our conclusion. This restates the hypothesis. It identifies whether it was proven wrong or right, and uses the data to explain what happened. You don't say that I was correct in my hypothesis. You say the data shows that the hypothesis is proven. So what I'm going to show you now is a 4-minute video of the Mythbusters experiment, basically then the actual testing portion.
Jamie and Adam are testing if the extra thrust you'd get from swimming through syrup might just counteract the added resistance. So now they'll mix up one last batch with a texture that's more like good old maple syrup. Not too thick, not too thin, but just right.
That's the Goldilocks myth. We're mixing up a batch right now, and soon we'll be putting it to the test.
It's a blend that should meet any definition of syrup, 500 times thicker than water.
So these are Adam's last 3 swims, and given how fast you swim in the light syrup, his times in this stuff should be really interesting.
What's my time?
14.34.
Yeah!
That goofy-looking scum on top we call fish eyes. It's just clusters of guar gum. Adam actually seems to enjoy swimming in it. 13.81.
Yeah! Woo!
Good job.
Thank you.
You're done. You can get out now.
I'm officially done.
Adam's times were nice and steady, but it stands to reason that a better swimmer would be even more consistent, and that makes for better science. Enter this fine specimen. Nathan Adrian was a gold medal winner at the Beijing Olympics.
Hello, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh my God, look at you. That's perfect. You feel like running some tests for us?
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Let's start him off in a bent pool filled with straight water to set up baseline time.
This surprise of Jamie's is proving extremely fruitful. Not only is Nathan fast, which I expected, he's super consistent. All of his times are within half a second of each other. My times had about a 1-second spread, so it just means that the data is that much more precise.
9.81. Can we let him get out?
Let's let him get out.
Now it's time for this sports hero to swim in something gooey and slippery.
On your mark. Get set.
Nathan, just pretend that you're one with the syrup.
Almost dead on the money.
10.87.
Is that funky or what?
So weird.
You can bet this wasn't part of Nathan's post-Olympic dream.
Just think about it like you gotta swim faster to get out of it quicker.
A man with the right stuff forced to wallow in some very wrong stuff.
Awesome.
I can tell you're starting to get into it a little bit. It grows on you after a while, doesn't it?
As far as resistance goes, when you're swimming at speed, it doesn't feel all that much different than water, truthfully.
So Jamie tries to make sense of the stats. Nathan was a full 9% slower in medium syrup than water. More surprisingly, while his water times were super consistent, his syrup swims were much less consistent than Adam's. And with Adam swimming just 5.4% slower in syrup than water, which is almost within his margin of error, this myth could still go either way.
Do you think that you were slower because the goo was offering more resistance or because it was messing with your technique?
I'd have to say it was definitely messing with my technique and how comfortable I was in the water. It's such a huge disadvantage to be in such a foreign environment with the goop and everything.
None of which seems to bother our boys, but given Nathan's erratic times, Adam's prepared to drop a bombshell.
We're going to throw out Nathan's swim times in the syrup. See, we brought him in, being an Olympic swimmer, one of the best in the world. We thought it was going to eliminate swimming time as a variable. But because what he does for hours every day is swim in a clear water pool, following a line, going as fast as he can, the syrup threw his technique out the window. Mine proved the point much better than his do. wrap this one up?
The simple fact is that you swim just about as fast in the medium or Goldilocks syrup and the light syrup as you did in water.
Well, so I'd say that makes it solidly plausible. You can swim as fast in syrup as you can in water.
Plausible, depending on the viscosity of the syrup.
Okay. So, last thing, and I know this video is a little longer than most of mine will be, just with the inclusion of that Mythbusters experiment, but I want you to try at the end of your notes to write a 5 to 7 sentence conclusion explaining the data from the Mythbusters video. Okay, use the example hypothesis I mentioned in the notes, and we will talk about this tomorrow. Replay the video if you think you need to go back and fill in some blank spots, or if things went a little too fast, that's more than fine. And you can ask me questions as well if they come to you. Have a good evening.